Development Bank confirmed that it will contribute $500 million towards US dollars towards the financing of a new airport in Ethiopia, which is expected to be Africa's largest when completed in 2029. This is to boost Ethiopia's growing economy, especially in the tourism sector. Now, this morning, we look at what makes and shapes the economy of Ethiopia. For this discussion, we're joined by Ethiopian businessman and economist Zemedeneh Negatu. Zemedeneh, thank you so much for joining us. How are you this Monday?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on your program again.
Our pleasure. There was a time when Ethiopia was synonymous with famine and conflict and a dependence on foreign aid. It is now one of Africa's fastest growing economies. What do you believe has contributed to this evolution?
Right, very, very good question. Let me give you a very quick background. At the beginning of this century, around the year 2000, the Ethiopian economy, as measured by the GDP, was about $10 billion, which is obviously very small. And then you fast forward today, 2025, it's amongst the 5 largest economies in Africa. That's a pretty remarkable growth trajectory over 20, 25 years. And as you indicated, in the old days, the bad old days, I call them in the 70s and 80s, Ethiopia was known with a poster child, actually, for all the wrong reasons. Famine, and other things. So to have transformed to a point where it is one of the, as I said, 5 largest economy indicates that Ethiopia has been doing a lot of the right things. It did face some challenges, a lot of challenges actually along the way, but it has surmounted many of them. So the answer to your question, what is it that's driving the economy? And then again, context is important. In terms of its population, it's the 2nd largest after Nigeria in Africa. It's 130 million people. The demographics actually is very attractive. It's the median age of Ethiopia is under 20, 130 million, very young population. So that also plays in its favor in terms of its economic development. It can deploy a very large number of young people, trainable, educatable, deployable into many of the sectors. And I'll talk about in a second what those sectors are. So the demographics, as I said, is one of them. But if you also look at it from a historical perspective, it's the only country in Africa that was never colonized. It has a deep historical legacy in about 3,000-year history, going back a long ways back, actually. So it's a nation that's been around for a long time, but it's only in the recently that's been regaining, economically speaking, its momentum, the rightful place. So what are the drivers of the economic growth? And as you indicated in your introduction, it is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa and amongst one of the fastest in the world. So there are 5 pillars. I think the government has put together a strategy for the next 10 years. And their view is that focus on where Ethiopia has both competitive and comparative advantages. So one of them is obviously agriculture. Today, it's a very agrarian country. 80% of Ethiopians still live in the rural areas and farming, but it's being transformed from basic subsistence farming to mechanized industrial strength farming. So that's one of the priority areas, but not only basic farming or industrialist farming, but the value addition. I always use the simple example of converting the beautiful Ethiopian coffee from the raw coffee to Nespresso. That's the kind of value addition we're talking about. So it has a large head count of cattle in Africa. Again, it's going to leverage that. So agriculture is one of the buckets. There are 5 of them. The next one is manufacturing, especially labor-intensive manufacturing, shoes, clothing, electronics, pharmaceuticals. Again, that's one of the pillars that the government has put as a priority. The third one, which you also mentioned in your introduction when you were linking into the new airport, is tourism. Obviously, in South Africa, you have a fantastic tourism industry. It contributes a lot to the South African GDP. In the case of Ethiopia, it's a nascent industry, has not been fully exploited. In fact, it's just getting started. And it has a lot of beautiful features in Ethiopia for tourists. I always joke that the only thing at the moment Ethiopia doesn't have is the coastal line, but hopefully one day we'll get that back too. But tourism is it has a lot of UNESCO heritage sites as well. The 4th one is natural resources. Again, something South Africa is very good at. It's a world leader. And in the case of Ethiopia, and I talked to a lot of CEOs around the world with natural resource, oil and gas, mining, gold, and all that, potash. And they all say it's one of the most underexplored natural resource sector in the world. Ethiopia, they're referring to. So I think the government has put a priority. And to indicate actually something they're working right in the natural resource space is about 3 years ago, the total exports of gold, for example, from Ethiopia is 100 million. This year was over $2 billion, just in a span of 3-4 years by rejigging policies, focusing on certain things. And the final one, which I think is really doable, is ICT technology. As I mentioned to you, a lot of young Ethiopians deployable. And I think these are the 5 pillars. So what's been driving the growth is in 2 phases. The first phase, starting in the early 2000s, it was modeled with the state very similar to early days China, very similar to early days South Korea, where the state led the economic transformation. But it was determined later on that in the last 6-7 years that wasn't going to be sustainable. It was a lot of debt fueled. So and also it didn't bring structural transformation. In particular, the private sector was not growing as fast and as big as it was expected. So a transformation, a reform agenda was implemented about 5 years ago called the Homegrown Economic Reform Program 1, and then just last year, Homegrown Economic Reform Part 2 was implemented. The desire, the goal is to transform the economy into a sustainable middle income and obviously in the longer term an upper income country. So what they're trying to do, the government's trying to do is transform, move from a state-led economic development, which delivered results in the early days, but it wasn't sustainable, it was debt fueled, as I said, to where the private sector is the lead. And the lead indicator, the big indicator for me, and I'm sitting here, for example, in the first investment bank in Ethiopia called the CB Capital. We, as investment bankers, who just started operating about 4 months ago, are looking at these things. And actually, we're very excited. We're focused and trying to deploy capital in an environment where the private sector is going to be lead. So, for example, to give you an idea, credit, which is the fuel that lubricates economic growth, especially for the private sector. This past year, the data we have, the government has published and the banks have published, 80% of lending credit is now being given to the private sector. If you go back 3-4 years ago, it was just the reverse. 80% was going to the government or government-led enterprises. So that shows you that results are starting to be delivered, this transformation from a state-led to private sector. There are places where the private sector has a very significant role for what has been driving the economy. The government's fiscal year ended July 7th, 2025, about a month ago. They reported that exports were about $7.6 billion. That's a record amount. The year before was only $4 billion, and they're looking at even bigger numbers this year. If you look at the currency reserve, again, the central bank recently released this big picture data. And they're saying that they have the record reserves, foreign exchange reserves in Ethiopia's history, and the total foreign exchange inflow in the country was also a record, $32 billion, unheard of. So a lot of things are happening right now. There are challenges. We can talk about that, what needs to be done to surmount challenges, but these are just what's the answer to your question in a long-winded way. This is the result.
You touch on one of those pillars, those 5 pillars that have contributed to Ethiopia's growth in economy as being on demographics, and more specifically Ethiopia's labor force, which consists mainly of young people under the age of 20, you said, and it is low cost. So how can this be leveraged to be attractive for countries that want to tap into the African market?
Right. So let me relate to you at a personal level. I'm myself, we're involved in manufacturing in Ethiopia. I'm a chairman of a big international, multinational clothing manufacturing company. It's a European company. So I'm a chairman here. We today produce in Ethiopia for the global market. And the amazing thing, I got to be honest with you, is productivity in our Ethiopian factory is about 90 to 95% of our European factories. Imagine that. And we've only been producing in Ethiopia just a few years, 3-4 years. Our labor cost, though, is a fraction of what we pay in Europe for the same product that ends up on the shelves, not outlet malls, but on shelves in Champs-Élysées, Oxford Street in London, main streets in Europe, produced in Ethiopia, the same quality that we produce in Europe and other parts of the world. So that shows you that manufacturing, if done right, the structure right, the supply chain is managed, and most importantly, you invest in new people. You train them, you educate them, you share the benefit with people, they deliver these kinds of results. So my message actually is not just for Ethiopia, a lot of the bigger countries, including South Africa, which is very good at manufacturing. Of course, yours is a much higher end, like you make BMWs and Mercedes. But for the rest of Africa that wants you to go into manufacturing, you got to get right and invest in your people. In Ethiopia, out of the 130 million people, something like 60, 65 million are actually deployable young people who could do this kind of stuff. And also what is happening is the perfect alignment between what Ethiopia is trying to was focusing on in manufacturing, what countries like China are trying to do, which is move out of labor-intensive, low-end manufacturing. As you know, China is now the second largest economy in the world. I don't think they want to do clothing that much more anymore. You know, the shoes and low-end electronics, they want to focus on high-end. So the Chinese and others who are becoming wealthier are now going to offload these kinds of manufacturing to Africa, and Ethiopia is one of those countries which has been very well prepared because it's invested a very significant sum in industrial parks. If you come to Ethiopia, you have these massive industrial parks across the country, which were built over the last 10 years in anticipation of this kind of mega trends, things moving from Asia to Africa, and Ethiopia has been able to capture. So it is doable. It requires a lot of work. Market access is not easy, but if you partner with international manufacturers from Asia and Europe, and to produce it in Africa, sending it to Europe and obviously to the United States, I think it is doable. Of course, as you know, with all the big changes that are taking place around the world, with the United States, leading the tariff strategy that it has now, perhaps countries like Ethiopia, which has the lowest tariff rate, for example, for the US, which is 10%, which is the base, can easily compete with Asian manufacturers like Vietnam in clothing, for example, with Bangladesh and others, which have a much higher tariffs. So the bottom line is manufacturing is doable, but it needs smart long-term strategy.
Talking of alignment and citing countries like China and Korea, I think also Vietnam is another economic playbook that Ethiopia has touched on or extracted reference from. You touch on that state-led development model that works in two phases, but how does this model mirror the economic playbooks of countries like China and Korea? And should it extract reference instead of doing a copy and paste to ensure that it is unique to Ethiopia?
Right. Absolutely. It's unique to Ethiopia, but we have a playbook that has worked. In my lifetime, I'm old enough to remember this. In my lifetime, China went from being a very, very, very poor country to the second largest economy in the world. South Korea, and here's an interesting point. During the Korean War, Ethiopia sent soldiers to South Korea to help stave off the war with North Korea, okay? Because South Korea was a very, very poor country. So for me, a lot of the models, the development path the Asian tigers took is actually very apt, very applicable to countries like Ethiopia. It is not going to be a cut and paste because some things were done during a different era. Ethiopia is in a different environment, a different historical space. But a lot of the things that they do, for example, I mentioned to you earlier, the state-led economic development model was used initially by South Korea, was used by China, by Singapore. A lot of these now very wealthy countries initially applied that, and then they said, you know what? After a short while, the state said, we're going to step back. You have to Samsung, which was very, even though it was a private company, until it got its footing and then became a global powerhouse.
Yeah.
That's the kind of model Ethiopia adopted. The first phases is what I said. Now we've gotten into the transition phase, which is now saying, you know what, the private sector needs to lead this. The state will come in, intervene when it's needed. When the private sector is unwilling or unable, the state will come and intervene. Otherwise, but obviously, it's going to be a collaborative effort. One is facilitating, ease of doing business, making it easy for the private sector, especially the domestic private sector of Ethiopia, which is nascent, which is a teenager. 20 years ago, we didn't have a private sector. As you know, Ethiopia from the 1974, starting in 1974, was a communist country, a pseudo-fascist country, which destroyed all private initiatives, including confiscating, nationalizing residential housing. So Ethiopia is actually, in many ways, its economy is being rebuilt in a rapid way.
All right.
And that's what
I'm
we
going to
see
come
today.
in there as a Zemedeneh.
So that's sort of, it's not a cut and paste.
Right. I'm coming in there because we've got another guest on this topic and we'd like to give him a chance to contribute. But we appreciate your insight. It's always valued, but we leave it there for now. Thanks again. Ethiopian
Thank you for
businessman
having me.
and economist Zemedeneh Negatu. And we also continue then this conversation with Professor Peter Karungu of South Africa's Durban University of Technology.
Good morning. How are you?
Dr. Karungu,
Yeah.
Peter Ndoro here. So good to have you
How
on the
are you?
program. We're good, we're good. So,
Thank you.
I mean, this Ethiopia story is being hailed as a positive one. And I can't help but think, when you see rapid expansion in terms of infrastructure, I think of Zambia because debt is also increasing at the same time. And inflation is a worry. So, on the one hand, yes, it looks like a good story, but should we be worried about the way Ethiopia is going about it?
I think our guests kind of summarized most of the highlighted points, but the statistics sometimes don't lie. If you look at what happened in Ethiopia the last 20 years, I wouldn't say it's a miracle, but it's an effort of a population determined, one, to be able to build the base or the foundation of the growth that probably would turn the country in the next 30, 40 years. One of the beauty stories to be spoken. Look at it. Between 2004 and today, a GDP of 12 billion to almost 200 billion in 20 years is a good story. But two, if you look at even their per capita, given the high population, it's also growing in about 4 years, it's grown by 400 US dollars per capita. If you look at the infrastructure and the value add, in other words, the value add of what they do is critical to their growth. I have friends who visited Ethiopia not too long ago. And the story they are saying is they are doing a lot of what we call economic beneficiation, particularly in agriculture, and set up in the rural areas. Yes, the challenge of this is that if you don't control the macroeconomic factors, particularly managing the relationship between growth and inflation and generating demand that is driven by the masses rather than the few privileged rich, this story will be very interesting to tell.
I saw them reopen their stock exchange recently. Is that an indicator of the direction that they're going, that to have capital markets supporting their economy in this way?
If you look at it, the more you diversify the economy, the higher the likelihood of the stock exchange to thrive. In other words, they have moved from subsistence farming to value-added farming. They have moved from dependent on agriculture to diversify to manufacturing. If you look at the service industry, yes, the number of companies they will post on the stock market are numbers that are higher. The opportunities then become massive. Initially, they couldn't have done this because, like my colleague said earlier, they were highly dependent on agriculture. So I see a chance for them now to kick off with a successful stock market that could also drive the economy or increase or accelerate the rate to which they are turning it around. I think I must mention that they are also very good in long-term thinking. You look at the dam they are building, the Renaissance Dam, the new airport. They are projecting things in 20, 30 years. Countries like Kenya, the blueprint are there. The implementation doesn't exist. Therefore, you can be able to see a story that over time, maybe you and I will be saying, yes, we saw it coming.
The political environment always remains one of those variables, unfortunately, in a country like Ethiopia. But for as long as you have, and I think one of China's successes is consistency in the politics. Ethiopia has its own tensions. They're in the middle of a national dialogue to try and bring the country together. But it wasn't that long ago that we saw full-on civil war taking place in Ethiopia. Is this a worry, or if they're unable to maintain political stability, could all of this be washed away? I guess is the question I'm asking.
Yes, that is correct. Safe to say, most of civil war or most of the issues that lead to an element of disagreement among communities is not accessing the resources that they feel they deserve to have. But if you grow the economy and the cake grows and everybody is growing and they spread it across the country, nothing is as peacekeeper as the opportunities availing to everybody. In other words, I'm saying in the event they tend to grow and the grid is managed and localizing the economy to an element of one tribe against the other causes this kind of stress in terms of all the way pushing to the civil war. I hope, and this is something that probably I'm sure they are working on, is to minimize the occurrence of disparity in income that always triggers that. That's one. Number two, I think over time and the technology and the people realizing, well, the Gen Zs of this world are the young people who are saying, we have had enough of strife among us. In Kenya, I see that. I see it in Nigeria. I saw it in Ghana. Not that is solid, but there is a chance that the youth of today are not going to repeat the mistake that have been done generation after generation. That's my prayer.
Talking about ordinary people on the ground, I think, as you said, statistics can tell a story, but not often the whole story. So you could say GDP per capita has grown, but that doesn't tell you about whether inequality has grown either, the Gini coefficient. And I wonder what the situation on the ground is in Ethiopia. Is the average Ethiopian's life improving with all of this progress the country is making?
I looked at the statistics of their agriculture industry. The answer is they have become literally a leading net exporter of food products. And more especially, they are putting a lot of effort in making sure that the rural areas are becoming part of the so to speak, of what we call the roaring or the wheel that is turning the economy. If they can empower the rural areas to the level that we are reading and put the right infrastructure, difficulty as it may be, it creates an element of the fastest change in per capita. In other words, the per capita income will be able to also effectively be seen to grow and also to curb the inequality that is overwhelming. Remember, like I said, when you move from subsistence to some element of industrialization, there is always that element of disparity that comes with the opportunistic approach by those who have in power. I think I was reading another article saying they are creating the fastest growing millionaires. I just hope they don't become another African country with the 20 billion or 4 billionaires, 20 millionaires, and 200 people or so who are living abject poverty. Those balances can only be addressed as you and I are talking for them to realize the only way out is to spread out the cake for majority to benefit. And I'm sure, I think they are smart enough to do that.
Or perhaps as a final question, so the story is looking good so far. Is there anything that you would encourage them to do, whether monetary reform, debt restructuring, anything that you might think would help them along this journey so that it's sustainable?
Of course, if you look at it, and the case need to be told, if you look at how they are financing the airport long term, Ethiopian Airlines is able to release $2.5 billion to inject into this. In other words, I'm seeing a country saying we need to grow and rely in a domestic economy rather than external borrowing. Debt is one of the worst options in trying to grow an economy and be able to get our people practice, because in the main, the donors or the funders require to get their money back with interest. I always say to government, try not to jump to somebody who is giving you the loan with this condition, because in the main, you can be able to manage domestic economy and grow without creating a debt to GDP ratio in the 80s. It cannot work like that. That's one. The second one is one thing that people need to be aware of is create literacy levels that each one of the citizens of any country can be able to read, can be able to make choices, can be able to understand that no matter how little you have, you break your money into what I need to spend, what I need to save, and what I need to keep for my children to be. It doesn't matter how little it is. In other words, we need to encourage savings at whatever level and whatever income. One can argue when you have very little, you have very little, but you can never make much
Right.
by complaining, but you can only make much by finding how to save a little bit for the day that are coming.
Professor Karungu, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but your insights always greatly appreciated on the program. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. That's Dr. Peter Karungu, academic and businessman, talking to us about the positive Ethiopian economic story. It's time for your news headlines. Here's Joelani Tulo Ngwepe.